Welcome to the Centre for Legal Leadership and to Financial CrimeCast. I'm Sam Tate, Head of White Collar Crime and Compliance at the law firm RPC. And in this series, we will have the pleasure of speaking with leaders in the field of financial crime, compliance and ethics to discuss their experiences, what they have learnt along the way, and what financial crime issues they see on the horizon. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Amanda Pinto QC, Head of the Bar Council, distinguished criminal law barrister, and co-author of Corporate Criminal Liability, published by Sweet and Maxwell. Welcome, Amanda, and thank you for your time. I'm going to start with this question, if I can. It's clearly a fascinating time to be a financial crime lawyer and a criminal lawyer. Can you tell us a little bit about your career and how you got into this area?
Certainly. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure always to talk to you, Sam, but it's a particular pleasure to talk to this audience. So I started off making decisions which I thought at the time were the right decisions, but turned out not necessarily to be the right decisions in the long run. And I started off actually doing a general common law pupillage, which means a training in all sorts of different areas of law, because I was absolutely sure that there were two areas of law I wasn't going to do. One of them was crime and one of them was family. And I've been 50% right. But then I didn't get taken on as a pupil where I was. And almost by luck, I happened to be interviewed for the literally next door set of chambers, which was one of the best criminal sets. And I absolutely clicked with the people that were there. And I loved the advocacy. I loved going to court day in, day out. So that was how I started in crime, almost by accident, but found my niche. And I prosecuted and defended in very glamorous locations for those from England and Wales. You might recollect some of these: Luton, Ipswich, Camberwell, Green, Guildford, Wood Green, very leafy places, obviously. And I really found my home in the criminal courts. But I must say that over time, and probably to do partly regrettably with my gender, I was being pigeonholed into doing more and more sex cases, which I absolutely loathed, and I found them very distressing, and they were difficult. But very importantly, they meant that your diary was full every few days with a very, very serious case. And it meant that whenever I was offered any fraud work or even sort of drugs importations or anything sort of getting bigger, I couldn't take it because I needed to be available for the other work. And so I made a decision quite early on that I was going to stop doing sex cases in order that I'd be able to build up the other side of my practice. And that is how I did more and more drugs and dishonesty work, actually. And then in about 2001, 2002, I had this idea that there ought to be a book on corporate crime because it was burgeoning. There was a real appetite in government at that time to make corporates more accountable, criminally as well as civilly. And I couldn't work out why there wasn't a book in the area. And so somebody introduced me to Sweet and Maxwell, and I pitched my idea, which seemed like a total no-brainer to me. And they said yes. And I was very excited about that, thinking it wouldn't be that difficult to write a book, as I spend my life reading cases and writing. How wrong could you be? It was very hard work. But then I was very worried that someone else would, of course, have this incredibly obvious idea as well. And so I was writing as fast as I possibly could to make sure that my book got published before anybody else's. But in fact, nobody else thought this was a good idea. So there is only one book on corporate criminal liability for practitioners, and that's mine and Martin Evans, who has co-written it with me. And so I think that in itself propelled at least in part, my career, because I was the person who wrote the book, and I did definitely get a couple of cases on the back of that. And of course, as we all know, one's practice sort of takes on a life of its own, and you suddenly become known for something which may only be founded actually on a couple of cases, and then people come to you. So that's how I got into it, really. And as you know, Sam, because we were talking about it just before, of itself, the book is not exactly of, shall we say, J.K. Rowling dimensions when it comes to making money for us. But on the other hand, it has been a real door opener.
Yeah, so I've also been involved with co-authoring a book, and another edition of which is coming out in April, and it's a painful process.
That's shameless, Tate. That's shameless. How could you just plug your book like that?
Yeah, everybody who listens to this should buy my book. You know that's
and the fourth edition of Corporate and Criminal Liability will be out soon.
Well, they should buy both. We should have some kind of book deal. But I think it did change my own practice, in that I like to think I kind of went from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White. You have to you face your enemy down, and there's a lot of learning as you go into the research and work out where there are big gaps, and actually there are quite big gaps.
Yes. And the other thing, I don't know if you found this, but one of the things that I found was a real sense of responsibility. It was brilliant writing it with someone else, actually. Because apart from those moments when you just think this is just too big, I'm never going to manage it, there's somebody going, no, we're going to do it. You know, give me your bit and I'll look at yours and you can look at my bit. But separate from that, it made you completely accountable, because if, as you might be slightly tempted not to be quite sure about what you're writing, and you end up not really knowing what you think about a particular principle, if you've got your co-author saying, well, I don't understand what you mean by that, it is a really brilliant way of making you focus and making you clear about what it is your position actually is on it. And the other thing I found was that, or we found, was that head notes are not accurate, textbooks are not accurate. And so we felt very, very responsible for the content, that it should be as helpful and as accurate as possible for practitioners.
I might just take you back now to the earlier part of your career, which you were telling us about. And I was interested to know what you might tell your younger self, if there were three things you were going to you would explain to your younger self or advise them about. What would they be?
So I think one of them would be believe in your good ideas, and I've just suggested one. But I think, on a serious note, if you think something is a good idea and you are actually wedded to it over time, as opposed to it just being a sort of flash in the pan, I think you're probably right. And that has been something that has... well, in fact, I've told you about two of my good ideas. One of them was to stop doing sex cases. And it was absolutely the right idea for me. I mean, it was very, very difficult in the short term because my practice really suffered. And my clerks were very unhappy with me. And actually, they tried a few times to sort of, get one in under the radar. Miss, it's only a bail application. It seems to be a sex case. I have to read it and commit to it. Oh, well, but equally with the book. And I think if you've got a really good idea, I think that's what I'd say to myself, have the courage of your convictions on that idea. Secondly, I would say you can almost certainly get to what you want if you want it enough, but it may take you longer than you hope. I mean, that's certainly been the case with me. I wouldn't say I've arrived yet, but I think I'm closer to arriving. And it has definitely taken me longer than I thought it ought to. But I think being very committed to an idea and what you want to achieve, And if I may say so to my younger self, I'd also say it's fine to change your mind. It's fine to be flexible, actually. That's a really helpful thing. Because, you know, you do change your mind over time, and it doesn't have to be characterized as being, you know, having U-turns, which is what every change of mind of a government is, isn't it? But it can actually just be adapting properly to a change of circumstances. And I think that's a really important message for young practitioners. And I think one which I probably wasn't really aware of.
Yeah, well, by the way, Amanda, I think you certainly have arrived.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I'm hoping to arrive even bigger or better or higher.
right.
I don't know.
But I do think it has been interesting doing these talks with people in positions not dissimilar to yours, and they have often done different things, and that's informed the way they're approaching their current work. And really,
well, that is true. That is true, Sam. I think people outside kind of look at it and go, well, obviously, it must have been a very smooth path, and for me, it's definitely been more of a meander up the mountain rather than, you know, getting the cable car. And I think that's actually not at the time necessarily, but looking back has informed and made the career that I have. And an example of that actually is that very early on, after I'd had my first child, my practice was decimated. My chambers just didn't, not only did they think I wouldn't stay, they didn't think I should. They thought I should be at home looking after my baby. And my practice dived. And I thought, well, I'm going to leave the bar and I'm going to do something else completely. And I've always been interested in art. And I went and took a diploma in the history of art at Birkbeck College, which is the University of London. And with the aim of doing a degree. And I absolutely loved it. But it was very good for me because, first of all, in that year and a half, my practice improved, and it made clear to me that I really wanted to stay. And that was a brilliant moment for me because actually, having been at a point where I thought I've got to do something about it because it's so bad, seeing it improve and deliberately choosing to stay was a really important moment, I think.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to turn the conversation back to financial crime now, and just ask this question, which is, what do you see as the three current most important trends in financial crime?
So I think for me, the top one is globalization. I think the coordination of cross-border investigations and prosecutions really has become the norm now. And I think that's only going to increase. I think we're actually, for my part, rather regrettably, in a kind of insular moment politically across the board. But I think also at the same time, crime has no borders, and as things go online more, actually, there's even more opportunity to make things global. I worry about us leaving the EU from the point of view of how, in practice, we're going to remain at that level, which is, I think, probably never been closer, of collaborating between other states in the EU with our law enforcement agencies, and especially actually in one sense GDPR considerations, how we deal with those sorts of issues. So that's my top one. I think secondly, I think there's a trend towards corporates needing to be being more and more regulated, and how they actually deal with the kind of voracious public demand for accountability by corporates, and the endless greater regulation, and how that's actually going to play out in practice. I mean, I'm absolutely all for public safety, public health, public accountability to the public, but not at the cost of not being able to operate. There's got to be a balance, and I fear a bit for boardrooms, and I fear for in-house counsel having to tell people about the legal requirements of operating, let alone those that are perhaps slightly more, I say, moralistic. But as we've been talking about, you must make sure that your supply lines are appropriate. You must make sure that you're doing everything as possible to save the planet, and of course that's in addition to all of the other constraints on financial regulation and how businesses operate. And I worry for SMEs. So I think that's another one. And then of course we've got the pandemic, which is also having an impact, I think, both ways actually in relation to firms and corporate crime. Firstly, obviously, there's a great pressure on courts and investigators at the moment generally. So I think there's a pull away from investigating these sorts of crimes in favour of other types of crime. But at the same time, of course, everybody's under enormous financial constraint in commerce and industry. So that's a bit of a tricky one, I think.
Yeah, the CPS did change their guidance, didn't they, on charging during COVID-19, and that was something which I'm sure many people will have read about. Do you see any other evidence of COVID-19 impacting on financial crime prosecutions?
Well, interestingly, I'm going to finish my year as chair of the bar at the end of this calendar year, and I have 2 cases in the diary from before the pandemic, that one's in January and one's listed in April, and I have not been told that they're moving back. But there is no doubt that there is a real problem, isn't there, with the fact that the Crown Court listings are very, very behind. There are enormous backlogs. And although putting on a white-collar crime type of trial doesn't have the same difficulties as perhaps one where people are likely to be in custody and have security issues at court, it's still going to be difficult. And I'd have thought probably lower down the queue of what needs to be done quickly for obvious reasons. So I will be interested to see, I hope my cases keep their listings, but I'll be interested to see whether they are understandably put back to accommodate other trials, or indeed those white-collar crime trials from 2020 that just haven't got on. When will they be heard? I mean, I think that's a really big worry, actually, because people talk about these cases being paper-based, and so it doesn't really matter about people's memories. But ultimately, it's a combination, in my experience, of being some documents and then what you think of the individuals, and the individuals having to put themselves back in the frame of mind they were at the time they were making the decisions. And that's equally true of an inverted commas victim investor as it is of the person in the dock. And so actually the idea that memory doesn't matter so much, I don't think is right in real life.
It's just exploring that a bit more. I mean, you're right that typically white collar crime criminals won't be on remand, and so there might be less pressure to get them seen in their hearings, of any type of hearing actually. But I mean, also we've got, as is kind of widely reported, fraud allegedly in the bailout schemes of different types, and I wonder if it now would be a good time to be having fraud trials and reminding people that there are consequences, so that those schemes are ongoing now might be a good time as a matter of public policy to have fraud trials. If you have any thoughts on that.
I mean,
I've been fortunate enough to be involved in some of the groups, cross-government, cross-legal professions and other agencies, in trying to work out how to get jury trials back up and running. And one of the, at the beginning, I think not so much now, but at the beginning, when you were asking members of the public to effectively go against all of the government guidance about staying at home and not going out, if you can remember how it was in sort of March, April, May, June, to do a public duty, you had to make sure that the trials were a combination of very serious, really mattered. You couldn't have somebody being a juror on something that was every trial is of consequence to the defendant and likely to some witnesses or victims, but that there are levels of seriousness. So that was one thing. And secondly, obviously the length of the trial, in order to make sure that they gave it the best possible chance of getting finished. And I think that is something that we're going to be living with for a while, actually. I think COVID and the pressures on jury trials being kept going is agreeing with you entirely in relation to the signal it might send out. But I think there's a sort of counterbalance worry that long trials will not get finished. They'll be disrupted. And in fact, they might even be stopped, which would be really bad news, because they'd have to be restarted. And that's just not in anybody's interest.
No, well, thank you. And I think that must be right. Amanda, thank you very much for joining us for this session of Financial CrimeCast. It's always a pleasure. And I always feel that I learn a lot when we're together and talking about financial crime. I particularly enjoyed learning about your own journey through your career, and it's made me reflect on my own. I'm sure it's made many people think about theirs wherever they are, whatever point they've reached in their career. So thank you very much for your time.
It's been a real pleasure as ever. So thank you very much, Sam. Bye.